So tonight at the Active Travel Cafe, after our usual crowdsource news update, we have got three amazing speakers. First of all, we've got Alice Ferguson and Tim Gill, who are going to take us through what I think is a really, really important new report, Streets for Play, Streets for Freedom, how a child lens would transform transport policy. And I'm sure they'll be putting that into the chat for you to go and read later on. But they will talk us through that and be around for questions. And then we have our very own Ranty Highwayman, Mark Philpott, who's going to give us the lowdown on the good, the bad, and the interesting. And it is a mystery what he's going to talk about this week, but we will find out in due course. So before we get going on speakers, does anybody have anything that they would like to share this week? Anything news about anything to do with something that's happening near you, something that's happening nationally? I'm sure we all have thoughts on that, given kind of the elections last week, and or even internationally. Mark, you've got a hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't join anyone from Vienna last week, but I was on a party tram. So that drinking and tram was more important. Just wanted to raise people's attention to the London Walking Festival, which is, I think it's a Rachel Aldred and Tom Cohen event on Friday at University of Westminster. And tickets, I think, are still available and it's free. I'll be there. I don't know if anyone else will be.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. Could you put something in the chat
I'll
about it?
put the
Do you have
link
a
in the
link?
chat. Yes,
Yeah,
good
that would be
point.
great. Thank you. Ruth.
Hi, everybody from Amsterdam. We've just cycled 50 miles from where Jan lives, and I posted a photo of teenage girls enjoying cycling in rural Holland on the school run, which is absolutely fantastic to see them. They're all having such fun, holding hands and everything. My news is a bit sad that my son, Jack Mayorkas, who was a fantastic councillor advocate for safe cycling in Wandsworth, lost his seat by 67 votes, which is tragic. And he really was very good. And he's been replaced by an anti-cycling tourist, which is tragic. And that's just awful to say. But also, anyone who knows or knew David Dansky here, I went to a fabulous community event on Sunday run by Claire, his wife, who does this amazing I don't know what you call it, side-by-side cycling for people with learning difficulties and disability in Shepherd's Bushey area. And that was amazing to see her in action after such a tragic event last year. So very nice to see her. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And Sophie.
Hiya. So I'm now in Oxfordshire, but until recently I was in Surrey. So I just want to share a local campaigning experience of something we did before our elections, because we had elections for all the shadow unitary authority people. So they'll be coming into power in April 2027. So we kind of formed a coalition of, I think we've currently got 45 sort of sustainable transport community groups across the whole of Surrey, which we called Healthy Travel Surrey. And the idea of that was that we could use the election to sort of do a pledge and try and contact the candidates and show them that lots of people do want sustainable transport options. And then hopefully kind of continue working with them and get more on board after the election. So I think, yeah, lots of lessons that we learned from that. We were trying to do it kind of through the community groups and get them to contact their candidates, but that was quite hard work. So yeah, if anybody is thinking of something like that with forming a coalition, then I'm sure we can have a chat about it.
Thank you, Sophie. That's really great to hear. And I'm not going to put you on the spot, but if you would have a think about whether you or somebody else that you've been working with would want to come and do a really, really short talk for us on what you did and what you've learned from it, we'd love to hear from you. We have had sessions on campaigning around national and local elections in the past, and yeah, I think it's something that we didn't do this time actually, and we should be doing regularly. So, but yeah, thank you. H.
Yeah, I don't know whether anybody's picked up on Ben Knowles, and he's also got some exposure in the grocer about modern slavery and the abuse of third-party logistics, bikes delivering, vans delivering. I've actually had it from Tim Blakemore as well. The supermarkets with their home food delivery use people with ordinary driving licenses. They don't need to be regulated like HGVs. And there's some absolute horror stories there. a lot of supermarket managers have admitted they're doing it because it's cheaper to use vans with people with ordinary driving licenses. And in other terms of third-party logistics, I've come across the Cubia quads, which are electric assist cargo bikes with four wheels, and they are really good. They've solved a lot of problems which were plaguing the little ones, the tricycles with collapsed wheels. And we've got the Amazon third-party logistics contractor in Glasgow, and the person who's doing FedEx in Bristol are operating them. They're brilliant. They take off like a rocket, and up to their 15-mile-an-hour limit, and they carry two batteries to do that. And finally, the cycle parking design that Utrecht. I don't know whether Bruce is getting around towards Utrecht at all, but in 1996 they specified the tulip design because you could park 24 bikes on the same space as one car without using two-tier racks or any moving parts. And we could actually tidy up a lot of these hire bikes in London by using the Dutch type cycle parking, which is very widely used, supports the bikes, holds them separately, and loads in about 5 seconds.
Thank you, H. Thanks for sharing that. Tim.
Very quickly, given the topic this evening, I've just read my email from Cycle Sprog, who are celebrating their 14th birthday. They're going into those difficult adolescent years, but they are a brilliant family. Anything you want to know about family cycling or balance bikes, the works, from a woman, started by a woman who couldn't find anybody else to tell her what was a good bike to buy for her family. And now she's got a nice little business with 3 members of this panel, I think, involved. So yeah, they've updated their website. Go and have a look at Cycle Sprog.
Yeah, absolutely. Second that. Thank you, Tim. Anybody else before we go into our speaker section?
Sorry, Sally, I thought I put my hand up, and apologies if I'm abusing speaker's privilege, but I put a link in the chat to the Curious Cities event that Alice and I will be speaking at, but it's quite a major child-friendly cities event, and it's free. It's happening in London at the end of June, and amongst other things, it's a concerted effort to sort of raise this topic with new councillors and decision makers. So I just wanted people to be aware of that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim. And I think we're going to hand over to you now. So if you want to share your slides, and I will just say, please go away, everybody, and read this report as well. Please send it to all of your new local councillors and your MPs. But I had the privilege of reading this kind of just before Tim and Alice released it, and I think there's so much in it that's just kind of really kind of invaluable, really, as a sort of, and it might feel like in some ways there's nothing really new, but yet in many ways it's very radically different to what we're already doing, and it kind of needs to be said in this way. So Tim and Alice, over to you.
Yep, and I think Alice is going to kick off. I'm going to operate the slides. Over to you, Alice.
Okay, and chip in, I hope.
Yes.
Yeah. And just to say, we'll try our best to keep it under 10 minutes, but we haven't had a chance to practice together, so we'll hope for the best. So I was just going to start by sort of saying where this came from. Tim and I have both been campaigning in this area around children and streets for decades, and over that time, 20-30 years that we've both been talking about this, very little has changed for children, and in the meantime, a whole generation, more than a generation of children have grown up, including our own children, without the everyday freedoms that we enjoyed ourselves as children. And I think we've just both felt increasingly angry and frustrated at the lack of action to make things better for children. So we sort of decided it was time to bring together our thinking and the evidence and the arguments for a radical new approach. I will use the word radical, even though it's overused, because we're saying that children should not only be more considered, which they definitely should, but they should actually be prioritised. We could actually have an approach that starts with what's best for children, which would bring about streets that work for everyone, but also would really radically transform children's lives and health and well-being. So that's the reason behind it. We published this just before Playing Out CIC ended in March, and we're now quite busy doing talks and podcasts and things to try and get it out there, and really particularly try and get it sort of in front of people that are in a position to do something about it and to change things for children. And we think it makes a really strong case, but we'd encourage you to read it. I've put a link in the chat and see what you think for yourselves. So over to you, Tim, for next slide, I think.
Yes, thanks. And this is the structure of the paper, and very quickly what we're going to go through. You'll hear and you'll see if you read it, it's kind of a bit more of a cry from the heart than a sort of measured and impartial take. And that goes with what we're trying to do with the report, which is really to reframe the topic, or a set of topics, and pull some threads together and join some dots that maybe haven't been joined. We're not going to do an objective summary here because some of what's in the paper will be stuff that's quite familiar to a lot of you around some of the details of junctions and stuff. But we are going to try hard to give you a flavour of the arguments and the evidence that it pulls forward. And that's the order that we're going to do that. So I'm going to hand over back to Alice for a kind of overview of our basic rationale.
So this is our sort of argument in a nutshell. These 10 good reasons why we think a child lens makes sense. And we've got a whole chapter in the book that unpicks each one of these. So I'm not going to do that now, I haven't got time, but I just want to pick out a few of these. So the first one I want to focus on is number.
Oh, Alice, I think yeah.
Oh, sorry. So I was just going to pick out a few of these, and starting with number 2, which is the idea that children are the group most impacted by the way that our streets and cities are planned. And we did think quite hard about, whether to make this kind of bold statement, but we decided to stand by it because we do really think that that's the case. And we talk more in the paper about why that is. But just to say a bit, do you want to go to the next slide, Tim? So people, might come back and say, surely we're all suffering from traffic dominated streets. Well, yes, we are, but we would say that children have been harmed the most and have the most to gain from a change, from a shift towards safer, more people-friendly streets. So why is that? Firstly, children are uniquely vulnerable to traffic danger because of their size, because their brains are still developing, and because they just don't have the experience of dealing with this high level of risk that we've become used to as adults. So that's one reason. Secondly, children have very little autonomy about how they get to move around over their transport choices. So these two facts together mean that whilst most adults manage to get around by whatever means available to them or whatever means they choose, even in a far from perfect environment, children do not have that choice, and they're often completely dependent on others, on adults, for their mobility. So that brings us on to point number 4 in the list, which is that for children, active travel doesn't just mean a healthier, more eco-friendly, cheaper way to get about. It's the only way that they can get about genuinely independently. So it matters so much more to them in a different way than it does for adults. And if streets aren't safe enough for children to walk and cycle unaccompanied from a reasonable age, they're inevitably going to be both less independent and less mobile and less active. So they're missing out on a huge amount of life experience. They're missing out on, getting to places, literally, social connection, play, physical activity, and a world that doesn't support children's independent mobility means that those children whose parents don't or can't drive them everywhere are even more disadvantaged. So then the third point I want to just pull out from this list is number 6, which is that children have specific needs and rights that are often not considered or met by a universalist approach to streets. And I wanted to focus on this because sometimes the response that we've had from policymakers to making these arguments is, oh, but we're making streets that work for everyone, including children. So we don't need to specifically think about them. But putting aside the fact that that normally means they're making streets that work better for car driving adults, even within active travel, we argue that this kind of universalist approach doesn't always work for children, and in fact often doesn't work well for children, because they use streets in a different way than adults, and they do have specific needs. So we make the case that this child lens matters both in terms of the detail and the specifics of street design and bigger picture strategically. So an example of this, just go to the next slide, Tim. An example of this, just to illustrate, is considering streets as doorstep space, places where children can play, can learn to ride a bike, can be part of their communities. So a well-meaning active travel strategy that prioritizes speed, efficiency, purposeful journeys could overlook the real value and importance of this space and making this space very, very safe for children. That's just one example. And conversely, we also argue that using this child lens and making streets that work for children would end up making streets that work for everyone. But it just doesn't necessarily work both ways. And of course, all these 10 reasons run alongside the biggest reason of all, maybe, which is the direct harm done to children by cars. And I'm just going to hand over to Tim to talk more about that.
Thanks, Alice. And we do have a sort of historical section in the paper. We want to bring out that this conflict between children and cars is both existential and deeply embedded in the kind of whole debate around transport. And you can see on your screen a map that rather gruesomely maps out child deaths in one New York borough in 1 year, and then makes the case that what's needed is playgrounds to compensate children for the loss of that habitual play space. And so what you see is that the terms of trade around streets were set very early on after a massive battle, which Peter Norton writes about brilliantly in his book, Fighting Traffic. And that corporate capture casts a long shadow over children's lives and still does to this day. And another historical insight that we dwell on in the paper is if you look at the trends on the worst outcomes that happen for children, child pedestrian deaths and child cycling deaths, you'll see a grim picture that shows how for much of the last 100 years or so, children were being killed in unbelievable numbers. This is now British figures, child pedestrians and cyclists. And while that has fallen off in the last 50 or so years, it's been accompanied by, of course, a massive decline in children's freedoms, which people who are familiar with Mayor Hillman's work will be across. So one thing we're showing is how road safety concerns and child health and development concerns are two sides of the same coin. Alice.
Sorry. Yeah, just to add to that, I suppose we also say that the kind of traditional approach to road safety, the mainstream approach to road safety, just hasn't really shifted over all that time. It's still very victim blaming. It's still placing the responsibility onto children to keep themselves safe within this unsafe environment. And we give quite a few reasons why that's the wrong approach. But not least because it hasn't worked. It hasn't kept children safe and it hasn't made streets objectively safer. So if we go to the next slide, this is perhaps the most difficult part of the report. So each one of these hearts on this chart represents a child, pedestrian, or cyclist who has been killed on our streets in the last 10 years. And we made this chart actually in response to Claire O'Neill, who is a parent who lost her daughter Alice, aged 9. A speeding driver killed her while she was crossing on a pedestrian crossing. So the worst imaginable scenario. And she said, she just gets really frustrated by these graphs that kind of give the impression that the number of children being killed on our streets has dropped off to the point of being negligible. She used the word negligible to say, this is so painful to her because her child is one of these, represented by one of these hearts, is somewhere lost in these charts. So we made this new graph to kind of really try and, you can't get that across in a graph, of course, but to just try a bit better to represent what that actually means and to show that the numbers haven't really dropped over the last 10 years. An average of 33 children a year have been killed whilst walking, cycling in Britain. And, it's kind of plateaued. That's the point. So we're not doing what's needed to be done to actually protect children and make streets safer for them. And then, sorry, I know we're over 10 minutes now, but so I'll just speed up. And the next slide is just to say, we're also talking about how there's this kind of spectre coming over the horizon where it looks like things are just going to get worse and worse for children rather than better. And we have actually got the risk of, we've already got 2/3 of new cars being sold in this country being SUVs, which are known to be 3 times more likely to kill a child than an ordinary car. But also we've got this spectre of American style trucks, which are just, beyond belief in terms of their scale compared to a child. And in America, there's this unbelievable statistic that at least 4 children a week are killed, usually by these types of vehicles, in front of their own homes, often by their own parent, because they just simply can't see them in front or behind the vehicle, driving at a very slow speed. They're called front overs and back overs. They've got this kind of folksy term for this horrific thing because it's become so common. So, these are the things that we need to push back on, and we need to be really talking about the impact on children, not just the environmental impact. So, yeah, I think that's kind of getting to the end. And then our last slide. Oh, no, sorry, Tim. You're going to talk a bit about some of the good stuff.
Well, there is good stuff, and some good practice examples that we share, which I'm sure many people on this call will be familiar with. I'll give a quick signpost for Great Night in Cambridge, which I visited last summer, which I think is interesting because it's it's big, it's strategic, it's ambitious, it's not as well known perhaps as some others, and there's a rich backstory which I'm happy to elaborate on. And then we're getting to our final slide, which I think is you, Alice.
Yeah, this is just to sort of say we end the paper with some what ifs. So rather than saying, this needs to happen, and being very specific about policy changes, which, we can be, but we're not policy wonks, and we're not highway, we're not engineers, so we can't be too specific. We're just trying to put the questions in people's minds of what if things were done differently. And we also include a kind of checklist for practitioners to just very, very easily, when you're planning a new road layout or making a new policy, have you considered children in these ways? So we're hoping that it's a provocation and a bit of a manifesto and a bit of an invitation to just think and do things differently. So yeah, we'll end there.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
A huge thank you, Alice and Tim. I think I can see there's quite a few questions in the chat. So anybody else who would like to ask a question, get your thinking cap on and either put it in that Q&A or put your hand up. But I guess I'm going to start by just sort of, reflecting on that process of writing that report. And you said that about, you're kind of aiming it at a relative, there's a lot of detail in it, but you're aiming it at that quite high level of like there needs to be a whole change in how we think about children in relation to transport and think about children as people who have transport rights, I suppose. Where do you think, who needs to hear this? Like, where can people have the most impact in terms of where things need to change, even if it's not sort of the specifics?
I mean, I'll leap in to start. I think there's a group of people who are kind of open to ambition for a new or a big shift around transport, who are maybe not totally immersed in the topic or haven't given children that much thought, and who they're not, they're kind of in the middle of the sort of graph, if you imagine the sort of, the radical signed up devotees on the one end and the we'll never reach these people at the other end. So there's a group of people who include new councillors, who include more generic urban professionals, who we want to provoke into thinking maybe actually most of what I assume is enough, or most of what I assume that I'm doing is probably okay for kids really isn't. So it's that group, I think, or set of groups, and also a wider public debate as well, and really trying to open up a cultural set of questions around who and what streets are for, which of course is familiar territory, but I think always needs revisiting. I don't know, Alice, if you want to add.
And well, I think it's sort of back to what I was saying about we need the child lens at the very specific street design level, because so one example that we talk about in the paper is side junctions. And, it's brilliant that side zebra crossing, informal zebra crossings are now starting to become a thing, and hopefully that will become more normal. But we've seen some designs of that type of thing that wouldn't necessarily work so well for children. They're too ambiguous. They don't give the sight lines clearly enough and things like that. So I think it's about getting the practitioners and the designers to literally be thinking through the eyes of a child. Does this work for an 8-year-old, for example, who would be trying to get to school or get to the park by themselves? But also at the strategic level, are children really being prioritised rather than just being paid lip service to? So, Tim and I, and probably lots of people on this call, have been in meetings and events where children are kind of wheeled in to say how much they want to walk and cycle and they want safer streets, and everyone cheers and they're, given a pat on the back, and nothing actually changes. Children are still pretty much, they're just an afterthought usually within policy making. And part of the reason for that is, I think I've said this on one of these calls before, that children are not a legal equality group in this country under the Equality Act, which is completely insane. They don't generally qualify as an equality group under the characteristic of age. So councils and, decision makers are kind of allowed to ignore their specific needs and have done. So yeah. So mainly we just want it to kind of make people sit up and think and realize that this is important and urgent, children's health, and we didn't even really talk about that just now, but we do in the report, children's health and well-being is in a really bad way, and particularly for children who are facing inequalities, it's a really serious situation, and we've got to do something quite meaningful and quickly to turn that around. And this is one of the big things that policymakers could do.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a big thing to turn around, isn't it? I'm going to take well, I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment from Ruth in the chat. Ruth, do you want to say is that a question or a comment? Do you want to
Well, there's two things really. One is on the last thing, there is the 5 outcomes for children, which Sally, you will probably know about, which is about health, well-being, the right to a comfortable home or a warm home and all the rest of it. So it could be involved in the 5 outcomes for children, which is a kind of European or worldwide thing. But my questions, which I hope you might refer to, is brilliant presentation, Alice, Tim, although it's good for children, it's actually also good for the elderly and the disabled, who are often quoted as they need to be in cars. But if it's better and safer streets for children, then it's better and safer streets for the elderly and the disabled, of whom we have many. And also that as the children grow up, they will become much safer people when and if they do drive. So there's a long-term approach to this whole thing.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think we touched on that on in the paper, but certainly, those of you who don't know about the work of 880 Cities, I think that's quite an interesting an NGO that explicitly looks at both, as it were, the cities from the 8-year-old and the 80-year-old, and joins some dots there. And there are a lot of dots to be joined. And Alice and I have also talked separately about our kind of frustration that there's a lot of, if you like, compartmentalization of, for want of a better word, stakeholder groups or subsections of the population. And I'm not saying that big car is, somehow manipulating all this, but if there's a big bad guy out there, they'll be very happy to see these different sectional interests all lobbying away and getting small bits of funding to do this, that, and the other, and having pilots and demonstrations, or whatever. When I think what's needed is a much stronger and more ambitious coalition. But I would say with children at the centre of that, well, I would say that, but I think in our paper we make a case for why that is potentially catalytic.
And just to add, the other group that this would particularly benefit is parents and carers, and particularly parents and carers who don't have cars and don't have money. And we talk about that quite a bit in the report as well. And single parents as well, you've got this impossible juggling act, trying to get your children to places, and enabling children's independent mobility and active travel would just, make life a lot easier for a lot of parents. So, yeah.
Yeah, we never talk enough about the people who don't drive. It's always, how do we
Yeah. I was going to say, actually, and we also refer to a paper that Sally's a co-author on in which I can't remember the name of, but is a long name to do with
I can add it to
walking,
chat.
wheeling, and cycling with. Yeah.
Walking with children, yeah. And I think, yes, it's that kind of, we tend to think about mode shift because we start with the problem as being the traffic and the congestion, whereas actually it's you're looking at it the wrong way down the telescope then, aren't you? Yeah. I'm going to bring H in. He's waving now. Have you got
well, Yeah, well, I'm the sort of person who usurps things from the underside and wants to start the dominoes tipping, because we want to talk possibly about bike buses. And my kids were cycling to school from about 6 with me in escorting them. And then we got other local kids that they knew in the area. We used to go on bike rides. It's to get that inertia of the tipping point, very much like bike buses are the tipping point. They get people thinking, I can get to school on a bike. And it begins to make that sort of tipping point that everybody thinks in that manner. And then they start to recognize all the tight spots where you need to correct something. And then the pressure comes on to correct it. I've seen this in London, particularly with Blackfriars Bridge, because when the railway line closed, we had a 1,000% increase in the number of people parking bikes at Waterloo. And by the time they'd finished that, 50% of the vehicles crossing Blackfriars Bridge were cyclists. And that put the pressure on TfL to then get the rest of it rectified. We've got a position where we need to have that sort of growing groundswell of people saying, we can do this, we can get to school, we can escort our kids to school. The other kids see it and want to join in, and then it becomes a bit more snowballing effect. The Danish had it, which we did in the 1984 report, Safe Routes to School. It's a little vicious circle versus virtuous circle. And the vicious circle is more and more parents are taking their children to school by car because the roads around the school are so dangerous, because more and more parents are taking their children to school by car. It becomes a sort of cyclic thing. And the virtuous circle is to reverse it. More and more children are cycling to school because the roads are safer, because more and more children are cycling to school because the roads are safer. Can we not try and turn that into a virtuous circle?
Well,
absolutely.
I think people have tried that, haven't they?
I was going to say the other vicious circle that we talk about is the way that children have sort of been removed from the public realm, and they're no longer so visible, they're not seen and heard, so they're much easier to ignore, both by decision makers and by car drivers. So it just, makes the environment and the situation worse for children. Whereas, things like bike buses and Kiddical Mass and play streets and these schemes that are not the long-term answer, because they are very managed by adults, are part of putting children back in front of all of us, I suppose, making the point that children belong in this space and we need to consider their needs.
Absolutely. Carla, do you have a question or comment?
It was more of a comment than a question, to be fair. And my camera's back in. There we go. And I've spoken with Alice before about Play Streets and how our Active Streets programme is really pushed. So we promote school streets, play streets, individual street play, which everyone calls play streets just to make it complex, just because of legislation. But my pet peeve really is, if I'm honest, sometimes, and I've spoken to other officers, we talk about designing for children, but we never include children in the design process from the get-go. So, for example, school streets, and I used to be a youth worker, so I'm really an advocate for pupil voice or young people's voices. You've got to include them in the design from the get-go. Yes, there may be some elements where we cannot remove and have to be included because of safety elements. And I'll give an example. So school streets, I always have pupil design element. That's part of the stakeholder engagement. So they'll be engaged through a whole package. Well, they'll assess the street. They'll actually design the street through Minecraft. This is the younger years. And some of those elements, so they prioritise what is important on their street to get them to school either safely and to, have an enjoyable journey. What I think, or what I thought they wanted, was colourful crossings, of course. They want a zebra crossing. I'm like, no, actually we want a bin, we want a seat. When we walk, we always have to sit down with our bags, tie up our shoelaces, and then carry on with an on journey. We definitely can't make that assumption as an officer, as myself, what we believe they might be or what I might think I would have been as a child and want, which was many, many years ago. It's not going to work now. And reports such as what Alice and Tim are talking about and have developed will help officers remember that they have to include children in the design element, regardless of whether they're in a policy, regardless of whether they're mentioned in the Equality Act. because otherwise we're going to be designing streets that are not functionable for anybody, especially the children or the ones we're trying to protect. So that's my mini rant. and a plea to anyone that's the equivalent of me to include them in the stakeholder engagement from the get-go.
Oh, thank you, Carla. That's a really, really useful contribution. And I think, and perhaps we need more youth worker, play worker trained officers working on these schemes.
No, they talk too much, honestly. No one needs duplicates of me. Thank you.
Alice and Tim, I don't really want to.
Well, Tim, you probably can talk more about. There was a scheme to train council officers, including highways officers, wasn't there, under the last play
yes,
strategy?
yes, that's right. That's the play strategy that the
Which-
last Labour government brought in a lifetime ago. I mean, I'll just say there's heaps we could talk about children's engagement, and we do have some things to say about that in the paper. All I'll say here is I think our first job is to get adults to care about children, and then if they care about children, then they'll maybe pay more attention to what children tell us and the insights they give. But I think it's kind of that way round rather than there's generations of work on children's engagement going back to Kevin Lynch in the 80s, growing up in cities. It didn't really get a lot of traction, and I think that's because it sort of just assumed that if we have mechanisms that get children to write, to feed into reports or produce displays, then somehow that will be by a process of osmosis, lead the grown-ups to do things differently. It hasn't worked that way. So I think we need to have a more hard-hitting, if you like, a kind of ethical position, and that's really the paper is at heart an ethical paper, and bringing children's voices into consultations or into discussions is one part of getting grown-ups to care, but we also shouldn't expect children to know all the answers. And there's sometimes there's a risk, I think, that we can put too much responsibility on children for fixing problems that are actually adults to fix.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to pick up a few more questions in the Q&A, and I think, Tim, you've kind of commented on some of those already, but just to see if that kind of provokes any more discussion. But Shane talks about that graph of child traffic fatalities and that they're more likely to be concentrated amongst the lowest income groups. You do talk about that.
Yes, and there's a terrible irony, of course, because one of the vibes around low traffic neighborhoods now is that there's somehow a conspiracy from the middle classes to, I don't know, gentrify and feather our own nests pick whatever outcome measure you want as far as child health and streets and public space, and you'll see that the children who die most, who have the worst levels of obesity, worst mental health problems, are children from disadvantaged neighborhoods and disadvantaged families. So, we do go into that in some detail in the report, and I think it's really important that people who are out there trying to build a case for, reducing the dominance of the car do make this point that this is actually an equity issue that goes exactly the other way to the way that some of the bad faith actors out there are promoting.
And I'm going to go to pick up Guy's question around prospective changes to the law around vehicle design to address those risks. I mean, I remember when they first brought in those kind of bars on the front of vehicles, and there was a real public debate about that. I can't remember what they were called now. I mean, this must be 30 years ago, and there was a public debate and they were banned, but there's no debate, is there really? And I suppose I would say, why is that? Why are we not having those kind of discussions anymore about vehicles?
I did look into this a bit because we're part of the SUV Alliance campaign, and there's a manifesto, if you go on the SUV Alliance website, that calls for some key policy changes, and one of those changes is around vehicle design and safety standards, but it needs to be stronger. The ask needs to be stronger from the point of view of children's safety. So we're kind of working on that. But I was really shocked when I looked into it that seems to be almost no consideration of child pedestrians within that framework. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty dystopian.
There's a list of bullet points that is going around about changes and proposed changes. Most of them are to do with tech.
Yeah.
They're untested. They probably won't work, and they go nowhere near,
So
tackling the problem.
that slide that I showed of the front overs and back overs, the American trucks, the only organization in America that's campaigning about that issue, their proposed changes or solutions have nothing to do with people not buying these big vehicles or the vehicles being designed differently. They're all to do with tech, like more cameras, and behavioral changes, as in keep your children away when you're driving your massive truck to work. Keep your children locked in the house. That's literally their advice to kind of prevent these so-called accidents from happening. And it just shows the level of motor normativity that has been absorbed. There's absolutely no question of reconsidering the idea of having these massive trucks in the first place, or making their design.
Direction of travel, isn't it? We are behind, but we're following on. Is that what the future looks like?
Yeah, but I guess we're saying we do still have an opportunity to prevent things going down that horrific route. So
and then I'm going to pick up one from Mark Strong, who asks about the NPPF consultation. So that's National Planning Policy Framework, sort of thinking about future planning. So he says this is a subset of engagement with local plans, typically looking forwards 15 to 20 years and not consulting children, misses out on people who will be most affected. So I think that's coming back a little bit to that kind of, children having a say. But equally, I guess we could rethink of that in terms of thinking about children, considering children. And
so I guess the bigger picture. We did actually jointly respond to the initial NPPF consultation, and I think partly as a result of that, not just us, like lots of our allies did feed in that children need to be much more explicitly considered in the design guidance. And the new draft guidance that's come out actually does talk about the need for safe doorstep playable space for children and safer streets for children specifically. So that does feel like a move in the right direction, like one of the few. But yeah,
I think I would say I'm hearing people use that terminology more, people talking about doorstep play, which I think is a real positive, and just shows how much kind of work has gone in to try and get that message out, which is kind of a consistent message over, as we know, many decades, that is what children need. I think if there's no more questions, I just want to thank Alice and Tim enormously for coming on and sharing that. Amazing work, and as I said, please do read it. Please do share it as widely as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
And then we're going to move on now to Mark. What are you sharing with us tonight?
I'm going to try and share the screen first.
Yeah.
Let's get that right, shall we? Yeah, there we go. Oh, well, I'm going to keep a little bit and show you two things tonight. So let's dive straight in with some super extra geek content. Right, let's just get the screen working. Look at this little thing. Cost me £2. And it's a ruler with, I don't know, a red thing on it, which you can measure curb heights with. How about that? And there you go. So you measure the thing down. It's like a reverse ruler, and you read off the dimension. And this one between 32 and 34, which is 33 millimeters. I'm sure that even national contractors, national highways, and others have the skills to use this thing. There we go. Right, £2. Let's move on. So I'm actually going to be talking about building Belgian burgers Flemish style. So a few weeks ago, I was on holiday. I was in Flanders, and I happened to be cycling along the N70 west of Antwerp, which is kind of like a UK trunk road, A road. Here we are. There's Antwerp. I was heading over to the west or the northwest of Antwerp, back in the Netherlands, to Hals, and happened to stop in Beveren in East Flanders. There's their flag. Let's zoom in a little bit more. This is an odd looking roundabout, we said as we came up to it. Here's the aerial view. So is this the hamburger we were looking for? So for those that don't know, we have junctions where there's behind the roundabout thing, and through the middle there's a road, and it looks a bit like a hamburger. So that's where the idea of hamburger junction comes from. So this one on the ground, let's look at some features, because it's actually quite interesting, it's quite good, and there's something bad about it. So local context, retail parks, industrial estates, to the north of the junction, to the south, residential development and redevelopment, lots of houses being built as we came through. So was this to manage traffic access in the industrial estate? Maybe. Here's another clue. Lots of buses running through the area. It gets something to do with buses. Yeah, maybe that too. Let's go to the site. So we're going to enter the hamburger here. Lots going on. So let's have a look at breaking this down into a bit of detail. So we have some traffic signals. Now, bearing in mind, this is all the wrong way around for us, so bear with me. As you can see on the approach here, we have just a bus lane on the offside position. So general traffic lane on the near side, bus lane on the offside, a set of traffic signals, except the signal at the top is actually a tram signal. In Belgium, they have tram signals which buses in certain situations also use. With traffic coming towards us, there's a set of traffic signals that will hold traffic generally here to give the buses priority through the middle of this junction. And we'll see a bit more about resting on amber in a second. Here's a familiar Shark's Teeth giveaway line that's used across the North Sea. And through traffic has to go around the outside. Very tight, there's an adverse camber, so drivers have to go around there pretty slowly. So the speed limit's 30 miles an hour, but actually the road geometry forces you to slow down as you go through. And you can see industrial estate on the right-hand side, residential on the left. What else is going on? Some cycle parking in the distance there, a curb overrun area for larger vehicles. That's not a start line for a Grand Prix, that's people earmarking in the local lingo. So let's come out the other end of the hamburger. We have cycle tracks on each side, technically two-way, which is a bit weird, but a bit narrow for that. You can see on the left-hand side the exit from the industrial estate. So if you're going into that, you turn left into it, and you turn left coming out. No, sorry, you turn right going in, turn right going out. I said bear with me. And if you want to go left, you have to go all the way around, I guess, the skinny end of the roundabout or the hamburger and back on yourself. We have the signals again, but the opposite-handed. So there's your bus priority signal in the middle there for buses leaving the hamburger. Again, that has tram signals on it. And then on the left-hand side, a signal holding general traffic up, just so buses get the priority coming out of the hamburger. View from in the hamburger. Lots of things going on here. So on the top, you can see an arrow pointing at the flashing amber, which I happen to catch mid-flash. And that just means give way in that situation. When the buses come through, that signal will go to red to hold the traffic up. Bus lanes run through the middle. They're in concrete for maximum durability. We have some guidance paving on the left-hand side there. And then black tactile paving is actually made from neoprene. And that's to tell people visually impaired, you've reached the point where the bus doors are going to stop, which is a first for me. I've never seen that. That was quite interesting. Let's look from the other direction. And we've got other things going on here. So here's a nice bus shelter. Decent view. It's all nice and clear to see buses and what's going on. We have a high curb for level boarding with bus. And we have guard railing which is kind of pushing people in another direction, very much like a tram stop. Again, you can just see the amber signal in the distance. And if you've got really sharp eyes, you can see the exit bus priority signal, which is again tram signal. So taking a step slightly further back, the whole thing incorporates a crossing. So pedestrians get a zebra across the bus lanes and then across the traffic lanes in each direction. Cyclists have to give way. That's pretty standard when you've got this kind of road across the North Sea. Everything is so managed in terms of speed and geometry. Quite often you'd be getting the driver giving way to you anyway. So there's your zebra, there's your cycle traffic crossing. Now, I did promise you something which was not good, and that's the actual entrance to the industrial estate. I didn't take a photo. I nicked this from Street View. So this is technically two-way. It's a bit weird. It's not as tight and controlled as we'd like to see. So we've had some good, we've had some interesting. I'll end on a bad for everybody. So there you go, a fully loaded burger with all sorts of things going on in the middle of it. Thank you very much. I will write this one up in a bit more detail. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you, Mark. Wow, I was wondering what that was going to be, and now we know what a Belgian burger looks like. I'm going to Belgium this summer, so I shall look out for that. Does anybody have any questions for Mark? We've got a few minutes. We can go into questions if anyone's curious.
Charlie, can I ask Mark one thing?
Yes, go for it.
I was typing in there, but the geometry of that junction, you're talking about large vehicles like trucks coming round. The geometry of that junction looks very generous because I think the European standard is 5.5 meters as the inside radius for the wheel, and that looks very generous. That could be taken in a truck at probably 60 kilometers an hour.
If you were going through the truck, there's an upstand, then there's like a
rumble strip.
What's the word? A slope for the gradient for the actual overrun area, and then there's a separate curb protecting the island. So if you wanted to blast air through a big truck, I guess you could in theory, but you'd probably come a proper.
It would be very uncomfortable. It would be very uncomfortable.
Yeah. So it's designed, isn't it? It's designed for two things. It's designed to slow most drivers down. And then there's like this layer on top of it to slow the HGV drivers down. So if you go really, really slowly, you're fine. But if you have to bounce over a bit, you can. But you have to do that slowly, even in the truck, really.
Yeah. I mean, I've also noticed that we've got rain gardens installed. Have you seen these cut-through curbs where you get a full 6-inch curb for rain gardens? I'll try and get some photographs of those.
Yeah, there's all sorts. I mean, sorry, Dave. Just the other thing to mention, I should have mentioned, is there's also a parallel motorway. So the actual HGV traffic is going to be fairly local, I would have said, anyway.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Managed.
Very good. Yeah, well, we'll look forward to reading the write-up, Mark. Thank you so much for that. If nobody has anything else that they would like to add, then I'm going to wrap up tonight. Thank you very much again for our speakers. We can thank Alice and Tim and Mark. Just to say that next week we have Thomas Abelman discussing exciting plans for a mini Switzerland, a national transport demonstrator for the Hope Valley at the heart of the Peak District National Park. And so, yeah, massive thank you again for some brilliant talks tonight, and look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye, everyone.